Marilyn Golden. Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. A project of Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund, DREDF, with Access Video, University of San Francisco.
I spent 8 months in D.C. the main year that the ADA was going through Congress, and I had 4 major roles. 4 different hats, 4 different jobs, worked on 4 different things. One was some of the policy development, particularly on transportation and also some issues in architectural barrier policy, structural barrier removal. The second was grassroots organizing. The third was lobbying, and the fourth was writing. A lot of written material, a lot of background material. I did a broader range of policy work on the regulations, and there it was very much on architectural barrier related material and on transportation. During the passage process, my biggest contributions in policy, one had to do with the alterations requirements in Title III of the ADA, and actually they end up applying to Title II as well. So for both the private facilities side and the government facilities side. And the ADA of 1989 originally, in the Senate version, the issue was new facilities had to be completely accessible. And there would be a more modest level of access required of existing facilities. It already was when it would be readily achievable to make the buildings accessible. But the issue was when a building is being remodeled or altered, what did you have to do? Clearly it made sense for it to be a looser standard than new construction, but a tighter standard than for existing facilities. The Senate bill said that you had to make alterations accessible. You always had to make the altered area accessible, that you had to provide a path of travel to the altered area when the alterations were major structural alterations, which was a very weak standard from the perspective of people with disabilities. And so we needed to change that, and we're able to do that on the House side primarily through our dealings with the American Institute of Architects. The interest groups that would care about what private entities, when remodeling, would have to spend aren't organized at the federal level. All the builders that one would battle in state legislatures or in state administrative hearings in any state in the country, if one was changing a state access code or a state code of any kind to require accessibility, are simply only organized at the state level, and they're not organized at the federal level, so they simply weren't on the scene. I worked mostly on this issue with Robert Bergdorf, because he was the lawyer that was handling a lot of issues around public accommodations. And I talked to him about my experience at Access California. We did a lot with architectural access, and we knew that you needed to gear it to a percentage of the alteration cost. And in the city of Oakland, we'd used 20%, and we knew that was a good number because the builders screamed about it, so you knew you were getting to what the market could bear, but the projects always went through. So you know you weren't asking the market to do more than it really could afford. And we were lucky in that time in Oakland to have properly minded, really conscientiously minded public officials who wanted to do the right thing. So we evolved that policy with them. I explained it all to Bob and some of the issues involved. There are issues that aren't instant issues to meet the eye. You had to know a little bit about the field, and so we worked that out, and he negotiated with the AIA and got language that led to a very similar standard to the city of Oakland. The good language went into one of the House committee reports, but there was some massive typo that was made in this large, very long paragraph of carefully constructed language that came at the issue from several perspectives and basically backed us in to the position we wanted. It was very cleverly constructed language that Bob wrote, and they left just through clear inadvertent means some stenographer somewhere had left out 5 or 6 lines because the part just before, it was and then, and they picked up the next then instead of the correct then. And so when it came out in the report form, it was simply completely illogical. A sentence was about things that shouldn't be together. And in fact, by coincidence, it ended up almost implying the opposite thing of what we were trying to say. So I read this and I said, wait, this is wrong. I compared it with what it should have said. I noticed what happened. It was pretty obvious what happened. I showed it to Bob. He said, oh my goodness, this is wrong. And then, so we ended up having to put it in the conference report, which ended up saying through an inadvertent, some language was left out. Here's the full thing. During the Senate portion of the ADA of 1989, which was first, before the House, the issue was that for key senators, we needed grassroots pressure. And since there aren't that many senators, relatively speaking, I was able to do the calls. Liz Savage, who I was working with very, very closely, she was still with the Epilepsy Foundation of America at that time, had assigned me a lot of the grassroots organizing. And so I would call into a state any leadership that we knew, or nearby states if we didn't know anyone in that state. I looked at who I knew and I looked at who my colleagues knew. And we would talk to those leaders, assess, we need letters going to Senator da-da-da, letters and calls. I would try to assess as best I could by talking to them on the phone whether there would be follow-through, mainly that, and get from them other names, and then call other people. When the bill went to the House, it was just far too big for one person to make all those calls, so many members of Congress. So the idea evolved to develop a system, we called it, of ADA regional contact persons, divided the country up into groups. It really varied. For example, Texas was one, but New York was 2. There's New York City and there's the rest of the state. And the same with Illinois. There's Chicago and there's the rest of the state. And if you don't know that about that state, you don't know that state in terms of grassroots organizing. And so each of these regions of the country, which could be part of a state, one state, or several states, I would find 1 or possibly 2, but usually 1 person that would serve as ADA regional contact person. Usually I used people I knew from working grassroots on the Senate side, or others I knew from the disability community, and tried to find, people that were really responsible and really together, take the best people. And we had this list, this typed up, distributed list of ADA regional contact people across the country. And their primary job was to get others writing letters and making calls to particular members of Congress when that was needed, mostly because they were on a committee, one of the many committees that considered the ADA. 4 formal committees considered it, and the 5th, the Small Business Committee, had a role. I think it did work, and sometimes it worked very well. For example, sometimes something interesting would happen locally that they fed back to us, whether it was a wonderful rally that they held that made buttons that no one had ever seen before in the ADA that were passed around DC, or whether some local article came out that had to be countered, or some presentation by a member of Congress saying something negative about the ADA that needed to be countered. We would hear about it. Certainly information went down the chain, also went up the chain. There were other grassroots. Liz Savage was doing mailings from the Epilepsy Foundation to large numbers of people across the country, but the grassroots mobilization was also through this ADA Regional Contact Persons Network, and I would send them periodic updates every few weeks, what's happening with the bill, this committee, that committee, what was needed. It was really interesting to, first of all, be in touch with people with disabilities all over the country. I was really lucky to be the person that got to be in that position. When we needed work in a special way, at one point, I think it was with Bob Michael, the Republican Senate leader, on his position on a particular committee, we needed a lot of pressure, and so we ended up asking the ADA regional contact people in the non-Chicago part of Illinois to hold pickets, to hold peaceful picketing continuous, as much as possible, though very polite, but continuous, and at his offices. It was really interesting because it worked, and the position softened up fairly quickly, but we were hearing stories about how their staff is bringing us coffee in the morning because it's very cold outside. So they did not want, this was not a part of the country that really was ready to thumb their nose at protests. And so it didn't take much. I remember getting the assignment and calling the people, and it happened fairly quickly. So we were able to mobilize people. Not a lot of people knew that much about what was in the law, but they definitely knew the importance of it. And you really could get people's attention by calling and saying, I'm with DREDF and I'm working on the Americans with Disabilities Act. I'm calling from Washington, D.C., and we really need grassroots. Oh, my goodness, yeah, I've heard about that. It's really important. Thank you for calling me. And people would make time, the best people in the state would make time in their busy lives to do this. Why? Because people wanted their civil rights. I mean, it was clear that the community was ready, but not organized yet. It needed to be organized, but it was ready. And people rallied in a huge way. We've said during the battle and since that the easiest issue to get complete unity on in the disability community nationwide is civil rights. The support was there not only because every organization agreed philosophically that people with disabilities needed civil rights, but because there was this community awareness of what was going on across the country. And so it set the community up subsequently to be viciously, ardently, vigorously defensive of and protective of the ADA, to write letters in terms of comments on the regulations, to be ralliable when threats to the ADA have come up. That's the easiest issue to mobilize the national community on, is defense of the ADA. Transportation is very definitely something that was developed significantly during passage. There were a number of different dimensions. One, for example, public transit agencies' buses, the bus that comes to the street corner, should new buses be required to have lifts? That is something that was not an issue until the bill came to the House floor. And there were a couple of amendments that were defeated when the bill came to the House floor in May of 1989. One was that cities with, serious winners, the Buffalo, New Yorks, and so forth, shouldn't have to have lifts on new buses, shouldn't be required to put lifts or ramps on new buses. It was ironic because both in Buffalo and Syracuse, they had lifts on buses, the two of the wintriest cities in this country. Earlier in the bill, in committee, big issues included rail issues. For example, all new rail cars had to be accessible, but there were disputes over whether within 5 years of the ADA's passage, did each train have to have one accessible car? Because that could mean retrofit. If they had not bought new train cars in that time, they would have had to retrofit a car, which is the only place in the whole ADA bill or law that retrofit of vehicles would have been required, because in the ADA the concept is you only make new vehicles accessible, and gradually as vehicles wear out and are replaced, they all become accessible. So the House Subcommittee on the Transportation Subcommittee said that, took away the one car per train in 5 years, but the full committee put it back. And other rail issues were being fleshed out at that time. There was opposition by some key House leaders from Illinois on behalf of the Chicago rail systems. And Jim Weissman from EPVA was meeting with them to talk about that, and I think must have worked that out. And the fact that Jim had won excellent settlements in 2 rail system suits under 504 in New York and Philadelphia, and that those settlement agreements were considered models for what would happen. That, I think, was key to the success of that part of the ADA. The other big issue that became controversial and had a lot of drama to it was Greyhound. Greyhound, which is the nation's largest inner-city bus carrier and is private, of course, had always been very resistant to accessibility and had already become a favorite target of ADAPT, which only served to stiffen their resistance. They were headed by Fred Curry, who did not want any part of accessibility for people with disabilities. There was practically an ideological revulsion. I mean, this was not just, we don't want to be bothered, this was like an anathema. This was against a background of a company that was very, very troubled and went from management crisis to management crisis. So some of the drama was that Fred Curry, in a congressional hearing, had maps of the district of each of the House members on the committee that was sitting in the hearing, and he had diagrams of which Greyhound bus routes existed in that state and which ones, the green ones, would be cut if the ADA made Greyhound have each new bus having to be accessible. Even though the ADA did not initially make Greyhound do that, Greyhound cut those routes anyway because of, again, their management fiascos and their financial fiascos. But what ended up happening was, it was clear that if this issue was pushed, we would have lost. There was considerable sympathy for Greyhound and its travails in Congress, and so Steny Hoyer and Pat Wright and I think Ralph Neese made an arrangement, cut an agreement that there would be a delay. The Office of Technology Assessment would conduct a study about the feasibility of making over-the-road buses, which are what Greyhound buses are called, accessible. And then DOT would put out a regulation by 1994. That became 1998. And thank God for who was the DOT secretary in 1998, Rodney Slater. We have a good regulation for Greyhound that is merely a year and a half old as I speak here, a decade after the events that I'm talking about. So it was a good gamble, the deal that got cut. In retrospect, it's proven to be very, very wise. The philosophy has been, and this is also something I feel like I learned from Pat, that when you can't get the position that you want, get that position with a delay rather than weakening. Weaken the when, not the what. I remember when the bill was about to go to the House floor, and it was going to be on a Monday in May, and I was at a meeting with Liz and Pat and others the previous Friday. And we did whatever we were doing, and we were then just talking. And I remember saying to Pat that I was terrified about what was going to happen. And she said, "No, it's fun." And that, I haven't forgotten that. Well, what were they going to do to what felt like, my precious bill, our precious bill that we had nurtured, and each word, I mean, we had sort of evolved, and we had defended, and we had lobbied, and we had written, and we had done all these things on each little issue, in committee after committee, and the ADA was so broad, and then it was going to the House, and they could do anything. And there were these significant weakening amendments that had been proposed that they were going to vote on. It almost didn't seem like it. I mean, clearly they make the laws; they're theirs to make, but it didn't feel like theirs. It felt like ours. And there were these issues that really looked like they weren't going to turn out right, and I largely would have to look at Pat, and my hat went off because she would hold out for everything, hold out for everything, to a point that was so late that I thought, surely this can't work out. And then, right before it culminated, she would cut a deal so it was okay. And how you know when to hold out and when to cut a deal is something that I learned something about, but I'm not sure I have full mastery of, that I think is an amazing skill that she has. I was surprised that it was as legitimate, may I say. For example, if you had better arguments and you had strong grassroots support, you would be a lot more likely to win in a discussion on an amendment. In fact, there was real consideration of issues under the ADA because neither side was ideologically organized in a powerfully charged emotional way. So issues were considered. I remember being involved peripherally in the education of one congressman, Steve Bartlett from Dallas, on the provisions of Title I of the ADA, the employment provisions. He became very important to the law's passage. He was a Republican, very thoughtful and intelligent person who, it was after a hearing or a markup, and he just ended up staying and talking with Pat and Chai and a number of those of us who had been there, and everyone else had left. So we were in this large room just talking, 8 or 10 people just sort of standing and talking. And he was saying, there's a very sort of complex interaction in Title I between whether something's an essential function, whether an employer is required to accommodate, under what conditions, and several different parts of the ADA all sort of work together to make the employer have enough protection and the person with a disability enough protection. And so he was asking questions, why should an employer have to do this? Oh, because there's this area over there for them. Well, then they get to do that, but there's this over here for them. And you could just see the learning curve at work. And he, took it in and said, okay, see? And he said, the world is changing. And the ADA is going to make it changing faster. He told this anecdote where he was in a print shop in his district, and he noticed that they had a deaf individual working there, and he asked the supervisor about that, and and how does that work, and so forth. And the supervisor said, oh, it's fine, he does XYZ things, and I don't know sign language, but he writes notes, and I can answer them, and I can write notes back and answer, and we do fine. So some short time later, he was in another print shop in his district, and he asked the supervisor, would you ever hire a deaf person to work here? And the supervisor said, no, how could we communicate with them? And he said, that's going to change, and the other thing is going to prevail. And he was very key in passing. So it was the learning curve in action. There was interest on Capitol Hill. There was genuine interest. I think Congress looks for things that they can do to show accomplishment. A proposed rule would come out, and we would organize the community to write comments to it. We would write model comments and send them out across the country, and organize really encourage the community to write letters on certain points that we were most concerned about. That was pretty straightforward. There was also an advisory committee convened by the Department of Transportation to assist DOT in putting out some of the more complicated aspects of the transportation regulation, which is the longest of any of the regulations. Most involved, I think, really had to be the most involved. But I continued to play a role because DOT, Department of Transportation, keeps trying to amend its regulation by weakening it, or in 98, there was the round of finalizing the over-the-road bus regulation. So each of these attempts to weaken or to change with the over-the-road bus rule, to amend the regulation, DREDF has developed model comments. I would write model comments. I would pull together whoever the masterminds were, in my view, in transportation all over the country and milk their brains, insist that they talk to me, and squeeze everything I could out of them in terms of wisdom, and use the knowledge that I had and fashion model comments. And some real informal lobbying at DOT, very heavy sometimes, informal lobbying at DOT. I remember Bob Kafka, who's a leader in ADAPT, but who has a real grounding in the community, saying in, say 92 or 3, maybe 4, how earth-shaking, there's no question in his mind, the amount people know and the amount of awareness, and even the things that have changed. Even though we always look around and say, this hasn't changed and this hasn't changed, and this place is still inaccessible, and this transit system, the paratransit is still horrible, whatever. But there's also huge changes. And you can also get a picture from Europeans and others from outside the country who come here and just don't want to leave, especially anybody who's here for very long. And it's also in consciousness. I hear people talk about the attitudes. They don't want to go home and face the attitudinal barriers. What you want in a constituency is rising expectations. That's the clearest sign of progress that people will get their prize, is rising expectations, what they know they deserve. And the ADA has had a huge impact on the self-image of the rights advocates with disabilities deserve. It's a very rewarding feeling to be able to look at things in law or in regulation and know not only that the organization you work for had a huge effect on them, which is also very rewarding, but in a more limited, quite a bit more limited, but in some of the sections, particularly in regulation for me and a little bit in statute, I can look and know that my individual effort, because of what I happen to know when coming into the position that I was in, lucky enough to be at DREDF and be in that position, enabled me to make an impact on a federal law that's a model internationally. It's such a attenuated situation. You can't just make that happen again. I want to be in the center of the cyclone of the development of a national policy today. It doesn't happen. It only comes up probably once in a lifetime. Working on the ADA was one of the most important experiences of my life, and something that I'll never forget, and something that I treasure and value, to both have such an incredible experience and also to make a contribution.
Disability Rights Leadership Series, 1999-2000. Producer, Phyllis Ward, Access Video. Interviewers, Phyllis Ward and Marilyn Golden. Post-production, editing, captions, audio description, Dave Newell. Stewardship, promotion, distribution. Disability Rights Education and Defense Fund. Marilyn Golden, Susan Henderson. Special thanks goes to both the sung and the unsung heroes who worked tirelessly to make the Americans with Disabilities Act a reality. The Disability Rights Leadership Series owes a debt of gratitude to the individuals who agreed to be interviewed and without whose passion and dedication the ADA would not have become law. The series would not have come about without the vision of Pat Wright, longtime Director of Governmental Affairs for DREDF, and Arlene Mayerson, DREDF's directing attorney, who conceptualized the series and the interview themes. Thanks goes to the University of San Francisco for sponsoring the project that included the Disability Rights Leadership Series, and the Bancroft Library, University of California, Berkeley, for accepting an archival copy of the unedited interviews and providing a safe and permanent home for the collection. The series would not have been possible without funding from the National Institute on Disability, Independent Living, and Rehabilitation Research. A list of the interviewees and links to their interviews can be found at dredf.org. 2015.